Good evening, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and use this because my voice doesn't carry too far. Thank you all so much for being here, and thanks, Matt, for the welcome introduction. I have a number of slides today. I'm here to talk about housing market fundamentals and just kind of give an overview of the Regional Housing Coordination Plan, the work we were doing with Compass last year. I'm going to try not to get too in the weeds. We've got plenty of time this afternoon or this evening, so if you have any questions to clarify, just go ahead and ask. We can take questions along the way. I think that helps everyone make sure that there is no dumb question. Make sure that you ask if you need clarification. So I will just get in. This is the overview of the presentation tonight. I'll talk a little bit more about my company and my background and my research areas, and then jump right into housing market functions. I want to talk about housing underproduction. I'll define that term and what that means. There's a concept we talk about in this policy area called the housing mismatch, and what that looks like when there's not enough supply to meet all the different needs that people have for their housing. Consequences of that underproduction, and then we'll finalize with the coordination plan and some of the ideas that came out of that plan that Compass is trying to put forward. ECONorthwest is the largest private economics firm in the Pacific Northwest. We have about 75 people spread across 5 or 6 offices in the Pacific Northwest. We have 2 people here in Boise. I'm from the Portland office, which is our headquarters. We were started in Eugene out of the University of Oregon and maintain a presence there. We also have our second largest office is in Seattle. And then during the pandemic, we had people go remote. So we've got people in DC and Salt Lake City and Denver and a number of other places. And we're multidisciplinary. These are some of our practice areas that we have. I'm in the planning and development team, part of the housing team. We also do a lot of education and social policy, longitudinal studies to show kind of what policy interventions can work to increase education outcomes, graduation rates, things like that. We do a lot of business analytics, looking at just economic impacts and jobs created by a landmark organization in a community. A big practice area is also our environment and natural resources, so a lot of that is tied up also in economic litigation. Say if there's a forest fire or something, what is the economic damages? What could be litigated? What could be tallied up for kind of a lawsuit? A lot of that in the natural resources department. And for me specifically, my research areas include housing supply and housing underproduction, looking at if you were to build housing or build out if you're underproduction, if you build it this way, what does that look like in terms of jobs and economic impact? If you build it this way, what does that look like? I also do a lot of transit-oriented development and sit on a steering committee in Portland for the regional government there. A lot of that's built into real estate feasibility, and then financing policies, so specifically affordable housing financing policies. I'll talk about that a lot today. And then I also study and produce research on housing insecurity, those consequences of underproduction, and the housing market factors that lead into homelessness is a topic area I also focus in. I don't do a lot on the behavioral health and healthcare side of that issue, but I do a lot on the housing market side. So that's a little bit about me. Happy to be here, and like I said, I'm happy to answer any questions along the way, and we'll just dive right in. So I'd like to start with this overview slide that housing markets are really subject to the laws of supply and demand. In the U.S., housing has unfortunately become, or fortunately depending on your position, kind of become commodified. And so it is a product. It is a product that's built and produced by developers, and it's consumed by people, consumers. And so it does reflect supply and demand. Demand is the aggregate community's there's an economics term called willingness to pay. And so what collectively do we want from our housing market? The unit type, the unit size, the amenities, the location, where do we want units to be built? The market will reflect that when you buy it. The developers and suppliers respond to past sales and past trends. And so supply reflects the quantity of new and existing units in a market, and what's fascinating about this industry is that it's really heavily influenced by government policy and government interventions. There's a book called Fixer Upper. It's by a researcher out of Brookings, and she has this great quote in there about how, unlike a lot of other industries, like the car industry or clothing industry, if a producer wants to increase their quantity, they just do. They just invest in capital and labor, and they increase output. They don't need to ask permission. They just do it. They need to find the money and the resources and whatnot, but they can do it. Housing, on the other hand, if you want to increase supply, if you want to increase your output, you have to ask permission. You have to ask the government for permission to increase quantity. And that's a really interesting perspective to come from. And it has pretty big repercussions for a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, and just like how we live our lives and the types of units that are supplied and where and how. So the fact that government has a big hand in housing markets is like a theme of today's presentation. So another basic about housing market functions is that we really need a wide range of unit types to meet the wide range of needs in a community. Every single person in this room has a different household and has a different preference for what they're looking for from their housing. Some people might want acreage and privacy. Some people might want to be walkable downtown. Some people might have children. Some people might have pets. Everyone is different, and everyone has a different take on what is important to them when it comes to their housing. And so ideally, housing markets would respond with a lot of diversity of choice, and it would allow people to choose the housing that meets their needs, meets their budget, meets their location, meets their amenities, size, a lot of other things. And it's typical, this graphic is sort of like the housing life cycle. Many of us might have followed a similar path of, when you're young, you move out of your parents' household. Maybe you move into an apartment in a walkable neighborhood, maybe you don't. Maybe then you have a child, maybe you don't. Maybe you move from your apartment to a suburb, to a house with a yard. People typically follow a path through the housing market, but not always. And this is also very US-centric. In other countries, people live with their parents for a lot longer than we do here, but this describes not only as a culture, as a community, not only do we need a wide variety of units to meet the needs of at any given point, but any individual along their life cycle will likely occupy different types of housing in different locations, and because their needs change over time as well. So this is a description or visual of new supply. You're going to hear me talk a lot today about new supply and how essential that is for housing markets to function properly. So the way this graphic works is that new supply comes in at the top of the market. It comes in from the left in the affordability, the higher income levels, and it, over time, depreciates in value. It gets older, preferences change, styles change. Like other commodities, I have a chart on the next slide, but like other commodities, housing depreciates over time. I'll get to this in a second, but so then over time it becomes more affordable, in general terms, it becomes more affordable over time. Like a brand new house costs more today than a house that was built 10 years ago, than a house that was built in the 90s, than a house that was built in the 50s. Some of that is due to preferences changing, like HVAC and air conditioning being standard in new units now wasn't standard in old units. Two-car garages, or even garages in general, didn't used to be standard in old houses, so you might have had a carport. So standards change, preferences change, building codes change as well, and all of that affects how housing depreciates over time. This process is essential for housing to change over time and become more affordable. And again, also for households to move through the market. So on that life cycle chart I was showing, households do move and typically want to move through the market and through the units that are available to them. And what that does is that as higher income households move into higher cost units, they free up a more affordable unit when they leave and go into a new unit. And that then becomes available for a different person to occupy. A lower income household can then use that unit, and so on and so forth. And this is called either filtering, or it's also called the housing ladder. And so it's this process by which households self-sort into the units that meet their need and meet their budget. And as housing becomes more affordable over time, new stock is essential. It's like a faucet. New stock is essential for this process to continue. If you have strong growth. If you don't have strong growth, then you don't really need to be building new supply, like some of the cities in maybe the Rust Belt or Baltimore, or Pittsburgh, places like that. Supply is also affected by renovation. Renovation can be a process by which older units are brought up to code or brought up to preferences, they're rehabilitated, and they will then become more higher priced. And then units also are demolished and just like replaced, or like a single family house is demolished and more units are built on that lot. The other point is that when there's not enough new supply, this faucet is sort of turned off, and the housing market can kind of get gummed up. It can stop, and households that might want to move aren't able to. And that's also where you have housing scarcity, something I'm going to talk about more later. But so we have a note here that gentrification can occur when that happens, and that also affects the stock. So when there's not enough housing and it can't filter over time, you actually see flipping, you see investment opportunity, you see more renovation, but you also see it from kind of commercial builders or investors who see prices rising and see low-cost units, and then they see an opportunity to renovate it and put it back on the market, and like that happens really quickly. And so that's not always what happens with gentrification. Gentrification is a really big, complicated topic, but it affects how supply moves through the market and how that faucet is kind of needed. The next chart is an example of this. These are real rents from 2 counties in Oregon. Data I had from a presentation last week. It is the average multifamily 1-bedroom rent, and the different dot colors are just 2 different counties. But the trend is really clear, and this is these types of charts are reproduced across the country, that older properties rent for less. It's just like kind of we all can think about this like fundamentally. In this example, every single decade of age corresponded to $125 cheaper monthly rent. And so that's the premium that new units command over old units because of their higher amenities and the higher standards that they're built to these days. And so without new supply, this line can start to flatten, and it can actually start to tip in the other direction. I've run this analysis on single-family housing pre-1950, like going all the way back to the 1900s. And because that housing is scarce and it has like charm and amenities, or not amenities, but it has character that you aren't seeing in new developments, it can actually command that price premium. So the line actually goes inverted, and then it's almost bottoming out in about the 1950s and 60s. Like, no one really wants that housing. It's not that great. It doesn't have a lot of the modern features. It doesn't have a lot of the kind of character and charm that a lot of the older properties have. And so this is a really fundamental piece of housing markets and how they function and how supply interacts with prices. And I'll pause if there's any questions. Sure.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that the housing ladder naturally would depreciate older houses. In this area, it seems to be a little different, just because our economics are changing, because we have such an outward move of people coming in. Mm-hmm. So is that something that can be, I don't know, understood easily, or
yeah,
such an import of people from outside, the Boise area?
Yeah, and I'll unpack that a little bit further in the presentation, talking about underproduction, but it's also, so thinking back to demand. Demand for housing is the collective willingness to pay. Willingness is a hard word, that's like an economics term, but the collective ability and desire to pay for housing is the kind of market demand, and that is affected by who's here and who's coming and who's leaving. And so in communities that are seeing like higher income people leave and lower income people come, or the opposite, you can have a really big mismatch in the housing that's available and the housing that's desired. And but demand, and I was giving an example earlier of Manhattan, there's a Manhattan, Kansas, and there's a Manhattan, New York. And like, even if you built a luxury tower in Manhattan, Kansas, like, it's not demanded. No one can afford that. People might not want that. The developer, and I'll get into it, the developer probably couldn't build that, even if it was zoned for that. And so the filtering and the housing ladder can break down when the demand outstrips supply, when there's too many people moving faster. I'll elaborate here in a second, because development is a really slow process and takes years, and it's pretty risky. It's pretty inherently risky. And so when you have the pace of growth that this community has seen, the construction sector just flatly cannot keep up. And so that process can break down. So just building on, like, why focus on housing supply? Well, if there's two levers, there's demand and there's supply, the government doesn't really want to affect demand. They don't want to reduce demand and say, stop coming here, we're not that great, like, we're going to make it less desirable to live here. No government's going to do that. No one would want their government to do that, make it less desirable. So really the only levers are through supply. The ways to affect price, kind of vacancy, availability, livability, is by pulling the toggles on housing supply. And housing markets are regional. People don't really pay attention to the county border or the city border. Sometimes you do if there's big differences in taxes or school districts or things like that, but generally housing markets are regional, and underproduction in one county doesn't matter, doesn't affect the overproduction in another county. So it's all like, the collective demand is regional in nature. And so as I was mentioning at the beginning, government can really influence development and construction, influencing the type, the design, what it looks like, where it's built, and also how much it costs, all by affecting supply. And then as we just described, the filtering and the self-sorting process all requires new supply, otherwise it just gums up when you're facing strong demand. And so I'll step through some of the basics on development fundamentals. As I said before, construction is a really long, complicated process that does not have a certain outcome. It is absolutely not guaranteed that people will build in your community. Like, there's a lot of communities that are not seeing any new growth, any new development. They don't have the rents that are needed, they don't have the builders, they don't have electricians and plumbers, they just don't have that industry, largely because they don't have growth. So housing development is not guaranteed, and is also not guaranteed once it starts to be finished. Most housing is built with debt, and that makes it really risky. When you're borrowing money and buying land and going through construction process that maybe faces neighborhood opposition or lawsuits or whatever, cost increases, rents, vacancies, a pandemic, you might be sitting on that land. You might have paid debt. You might be paying interest on that land until you can get the project completed and until you can sell it or get your rent actually flowing. And most housing in the U.S. is also built by for-profit private developers. That's just how our market works. And both the risk and the profit-seeking means it requires a return on investment. So. And in the U.S. And in capital markets in general, higher risk, higher reward. So developers will command a high return on investment because they undertook the process of risk. They fought the neighbor opposition, they went through the market feasibility assessments, et cetera, to get the product to market. And the other important thing that I really like to stress is that if a developer and or their investors cannot meet that return expectation, that money will flow into other sectors of the market. It'll flow into the capital market, it'll flow into like stocks or bonds or like energy sector or auto sector, like Tesla. Like, you can invest in a lot of different parts of the market, of like consumer goods and of even of real estate. if you can't get the return that you're needing and expecting to offset the reward, it'll also flow to other parts of the country. If you're seen as a anti-development, low-growth place that has tons of lawsuits and like projects take forever to get completed, developers will get scared. I live in Portland, and that is absolutely happening in Portland, where our reputation is in shambles, and no developers want to build in Portland because they don't think that they can get the rents that they used to be able to get a couple of years ago. And it's like there's a lot of macroeconomic factors and microeconomic factors that need to align for development to occur. And like I said, it's not a guarantee.
Are we going to chat about kind of what's happening here locally after we go over the big picture concepts, or are you wanting us to kind of stop at each topic? And
I have a few slides on what's going on locally, but not a ton of information. So I mentioned that several interrelated factors must align. This is a graphic that I like to use, my company likes to use to describe what has to come together for development to occur. The first is that what you want to build needs to be allowed. It needs to be zoned correctly, the density must be allowed, you must adhere to design requirements. If you want to build housing in a commercial zone, you can't. It has to be legal for a project to proceed. Then we're going to explore more of this market feasibility in a second, but you also need rent or sales prices that will support the profit and the return and the risk that you're needing to take on the project. So, like I said, in Manhattan, Kansas, you can't build luxury apartments because you can't command a rent. If you build it and you try to charge $3,000 for rent, like there's not enough people there who are willing or interested in paying for that. There's not enough of a market for that. There's not enough demand for that, so it won't pencil as a term. It won't be feasible to build. You also need to have sufficient land available, and you need to be able to control the site with reasonable costs. It needs to be within the cost of the land has to be able to be captured with the price or the rent that you're going to be able to command. And then lastly, as I mentioned, you have to be able to get access to capital and resources to be able to fund your development. Some developers do build from cash, but that's really rare. It's really rare for someone to have the balance sheet where they can pay out of pocket. Almost all investment, almost all real estate in the country is built with debt. And then when those align, you can have development occur. And the other thing is that all of these factors are changing frequently. The costs that go into market feasibility, availability of land, the zoning changes over time, and that's something that developers have to contend with, is that if you change the rules midstream, they have to redesign or they have to reconsider their project that they started designing or developing in pre-development years ago. And then capital markets change, interest rates change. A lot of these factors are constantly in flux, and that causes the outcome to be, like I said, outcome to be pretty uncertain. So a lot of factors in the development and construction process are outside of the builder's control. Like I said, the availability of land, labor, materials, and labor is important. The availability of construction workers, but also permitters and inspectors and plumbers, and so like a lot of the literal people, the labor that will go into this building has to be available in your local market. And if there's a hot development market with a lot of construction happening, you might have wages go up because the workers are scarce, and then you have to factor that into your costs of development. The fees that are charged by the public sector or banks, the rents that you can get are not, you can't pick that out, that's set by the market. Same thing with vacancy, how many other new products are coming to the market and how many people are there that can afford that price, and what is the vacancy like in that sector of the market. And then of course like interest rates and then the investment return requirements, those are not within the builder's control. They are price takers. They have to factor in all those things and try to assess what they can get. So the development value of the product at the end, when it's delivered and finally brought to market, development value is the combination of revenues from rents or prices, from parking, from commercial if there's ground floor, or like any other revenue you can generate from this asset. You have to say, take out your vacancy loss and like what you would expect to be the average amount of vacancy you'd see in a year, both on your commercial and on your rental property. You have the investment return that's just its value to the developer, and then you also have market factors about the fact that an asset, a building, is worth more to the market than like a piece of empty land. And you compare that, so this is the market feasibility piece, it's this complex analysis that developers go through, and so then you can compare all those factors like a year from now, 2 or 3 years from now, to the cost that you're going to incur over the next several years as this building is being built. That's the acquisition cost of the land, it's the cost of labor and materials, it's the fees, the design, the engineering, the legal, the insurance, all those other things. All of that combined has to at least equal development value. When costs exceed value, development is not going to happen. We'll get into it, but there are mission-driven investors, but a for-profit seeking developer won't take on the project. Just like any other business, you won't be profitable if your costs exceed your revenues. And so I will explore affordable housing fundamentals a little bit more now, because there's this huge question on so many people's minds of why can't we build more affordable housing? Why isn't there enough affordable housing? Why is new housing so expensive? And it really comes down to this idea that there's a minimum rent or price that is needed to be charged in order to cover the basic costs of owning and operating that property. Just like businesses, you need a minimum amount of revenue to exceed your standard operating costs, and that is your profit. If those are not aligned, if in the chart, if those bars are not aligned, it won't happen. So there's a minimum that you need, and some households simply cannot afford to pay that minimum. There's poverty, there's social issues that cause some households to not be able to pay what the market is charging or what is available to the market, or to them from the market. And so capital A affordable housing is housing that is income or rent restricted so that lower income households can afford to live there. And can afford to live there means they're spending more than 30% of their income on housing. That's a threshold that's been set by the federal government. It's been in place for a really, really long time. I'll get into it later, but if you exceed 30% of your income on housing, you're considered cost burdening, and there's been a lot of research about kind of the consequences that happen for households who don't have enough money left over at the end of the month to pay for all their necessities. And so affordable housing has to do the same exact math that market rate housing has to go through. But when you depress the rents to be below market, to be affordable to lower income people, you create what's called a funding gap. And it is a math problem where all of a sudden your rent revenue is lower and your costs are the same or often higher, often higher, because you are having to go fill that gap with free or low cost money. And that costs time and staff and energy. You're often chasing applications that are competitive and scarce, and there's not enough funding available for that funding gap on a new affordable housing development. And so the projects compete with one another, and the state or whoever is funding it will they will have a competitive process and award money to a project. But that, like I said, takes time and expertise and staff and overhead. You also face a lot more neighborhood opposition, and that causes delays. You go to hearings, and you have to fight to get this project to move forward. Sometimes you also actually have higher development costs if you have different quality, higher or lower quality, sometimes higher quality materials, because you might have larger families. You might have people who have mental illnesses. You have oftentimes, this is not writ large, but oftentimes the units, the occupants can be harder on units. There might be kids playing in there, and you need a solid core door rather than a hollow door or something like that. And so the product might have higher upfront costs that are in the blue bar, and you have lower revenue in the green bar, and so you have this math problem. And all of that slows down development and increases the cost. And affordable housing is also built with debt, and so you are having to, if the process slows down, you are paying interest on that debt the whole time. And so it just adds to the problem and adds to the puzzle. And so what do we do about it? Like, that was a big lead up. This slide is just another basic about when I talk about area median income or affordability level. These are metrics that are set by the federal government. For the Treasure Valley, HUD calculates median income on a family of 4. I don't know why they do that. Why it's specifically a family, not a household. There's actually a pretty big difference when it comes to the census and data about incomes on households versus families. But the difference being you can have a non-family household like roommates. And so if you're talking about someone who is at 100% of area median income, that family of 4 is earning about $98,000 a year. And if you take 30% of that and the monthly amount, you get about $2,400. When you drop to 80%, you can see the income limit and the monthly housing costs in each of these income levels. And so I don't know if anyone knows of a rental that costs $750 a month. Like, I'm seeing some shaking heads. This type of housing doesn't often exist. And the reason that affordable housing, so what might exist might be substandard, and it might be unhealthy. It might have mold, it might not have plumbing, it might have other like sanitary problems that society, it's a decision whether society is okay with people living in substandard housing. Yeah.
Just a quick question. The cost, does that include all of the housing costs, like utilities, or is that just the cost of housing?
Yeah, good question. That also includes utilities. And so there's often a utility allowance that's allowed a little bit on top of it. And these are the same limits for renters and owners. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that. So it does include utilities, he says. So that sets up a big problem, yeah.
I had a similar question on the last slide about income. Is it gross or net?
Yeah, income would be gross. So it's before taxes, which makes the math probably even harder. So when you think about the gap that is calculated and that is problematic and that is why we don't have enough affordable housing, capital A affordable housing that's built, there are people who do this, and there may be some in the room, but nonprofits, religious institutions, or even just mission-driven investors will often step in to be the ones that build this regulated affordable housing. They need, like I said, they need to do the same math. They need to also compete for the same land. When a parcel comes up for sale, these institutions, these nonprofits might want to build affordable housing on that site, but there might be a developer who can pay cash, and they lose out when they go have to find funding and get low-cost loans or grants that will allow them to be competitive and to actually get their math to work to build the property. This gap funding can come from government, nonprofits, philanthropy, sometimes from churches or religious institutions or other sources. But the biggest funding source for affordable housing in the country is the low-income housing tax credit, and it is a public-private partnership that has investors like banks and other like insurance companies and like retirement pensions and whatnot. They will invest in basically every project has an LLC that's created that sells equity in the building for tax credit for the bank, and so the banks can actually get a one-to-one tax credit on their tax liabilities, and they're required to reinvest in the community. The Community Reinvestment Act is a federal act that requires banks to, I think, make up for the amends in the past and reinvest in the communities in which they operate. And so the low-income housing tax credit system was developed as a way to harness the power of the private sector and private money in delivering a public good like affordable housing. Okay, and so as I mentioned before, kind of bringing that back full circle, housing supply region-wide really grows one project at a time, one master development project, whether it's 100 units or 1,000 units, one single-family housing at a time, one apartment building at a time. And every developer goes through that math process of deciding what rents and prices they can get, how much it's going to cost to build, and whether or not they will take on the project. So the rest of the presentation will talk about what happens when there's too little supply. We'll talk about the importance of supply. So what happens when there's too little? What does it mean when a region is underproducing, when the country is underproducing housing? And what happens when there's not enough of those low-cost units for people who need them? This is a way to kind of start the underproduction story. I apologize you can't see the slide very well. I'll try to describe it. But basically there's 3 panels. The farthest one on the left shows and every city has a color and a line that's basically showing the relationship of home price growth on the y-axis and the residential area growth, so geographic growth, sprawl for lack of a better word, but the area that's being occupied by housing, and each of those panels is a point in time. And the point of the slide is that there used to be a model where some cities, and these are actually cities, not metro areas, some cities were able to build out to avoid their prices going up. And either they were building enough units, or they were building a different kind of units, or whatnot, but their median price stayed relatively level. And in the chart, you can see the ones that didn't do that. And it's Salt Lake City, Denver, Seattle, Portland. Those lines go nearly straight, and they stay straight, and they're the ones that are nearly straight in all 3 panels. But other communities in the middle, so between the year 2000 and the year 2010, you can see especially Denver. Denver's the bright yellow line. They were able to sprawl outward or build geographically and bend their curve. They were able to slow down their home price increases by building outward. And then some of the other communities like Raleigh is gray, Las Vegas was able to build outward and actually keep reduced prices. Boise is in the lightest kind of cobalt blue, was able to build outward to keep prices from going crazy. They were not Seattle, they were not San Francisco, not on the map, but not Portland. And then in 2020, this model broke. This stopped working. All these communities, every single one. Look at Vegas, look at Boise, look at Raleigh, Austin. I mean, it's worse in Portland and Seattle, or Portland, Seattle, Denver, Salt Lake City. In Seattle, Portland, Salt Lake City physically cannot expand. They have strong population growth, and Seattle's hemmed in by water. Salt Lake City is hemmed in by the mountains and the lake. Portland has a growth boundary around it, and it's really hard to expand it. It's a regulatory thing. And so those cities also saw population increase, but couldn't expand geographically. And they weren't building enough units on the land they had available to them, and their prices went really high. The point is that some cities were able to avoid that by going outward, but that model really broke in 2020. The pandemic changed things. It changed the rate of population growth. I know I'm preaching to the choir, you guys all know this. It changed how rapidly housing markets were lagging behind the increase in population and the demand. And this is just a really, I think, fascinating chart. And it also says, you're not alone. A lot of cities have been struggling with these issues for some time. And building on that, the country has been underproducing housing for quite a while. There are many ways to calculate underproduction. Underproduction is essentially when there's not enough housing development to match household formation. Household formation occurs when people move into an area or a net increase in people moving in, but also when households break it from one to another. So when a young person moves out of their parents' house when they turn 18, or when 2 or 3 roommates decide I don't want to be roommates anymore and they go and create their own housing, their own household. And that's household formation, and it's also big on macroeconomic and demographics. So in this time period was a lot of when millennials were moving out of parents' homes and coming of age, and so there's demographic factors in this as well. But one of the simplest ways to measure housing production and housing underproduction is just a ratio. Did you at least build 1 unit for every household that formed or moved to your community? Ideally, we say that you actually need about 1.1 units of 10% cushion. So for every 100 households that are moving to your area, you need to build 110 units. Because some people have second homes. There's demolition, there's actual vacancy, there's other reasons, obsolescence, whatever, that you need that extra cushion, just like you would have your household budget. You don't want exactly $1 to $1 coming and going out. You want extra cushion. And you can see that since this chart goes all the way back to the 1960s. 1965. Since then, the U.S., or through 2018, the U.S. was producing 1.1 units per household. And you can see the aftermath of the Great Recession, that huge crater. And that's where a lot of the problems that many cities we're seeing is kind of due to that huge glut. We were not building enough. And really, you can also see the asset bubble before that. That we were building too many, and the market got frothy, and lending got sloppy, and there was an asset bubble, and credit froze, and it was a housing market crash, right? So this also ties back to the housing life cycle chart, and underproduction is a complicated term and complicated concept because the relationship goes both ways. It's something called endogeneity, which means that, maybe households so if there aren't enough units, households will not form because they will say the rent is too high and the vacancy is too low, therefore I can't find a unit. But also household underproduction is also caused by household formation. So it's a really tricky concept to try to untangle, but it is a phenomenon that's been happening in the last couple of decades across the country and in Idaho. So despite all the building that you've been doing and that you've seen, this is the state, it has actually not kept pace with demand, going all the way back. So this is from a study from the organization called Up for Growth, and my company works with them to calculate a seminal report that they release every year. This is from 2022. The data is lagged, unfortunately. 2020, it relies on census data, so 2020 was horrible census data. We couldn't actually trust the numbers, we had to omit it. But this is showing what the story that all of you know, in that between 2019 and 2021, something big happened, and something big happened in this region. I would imagine, though, this report is going to be produced every year. I would imagine that number, and my colleagues agree with me, that number is likely to come down because you have been producing quite a lot, and actually your population growth is starting to change a little bit. It's not the same robust growth, double-digit growth that you were seeing in the last decade or so. The point, so there is housing underproduction. It just means that the number of units built is not enough for the number of people moving here. I think you all know that. And particularly the pace of change. That's what really matters, because development is that long process and it lags. And a person moves here today and a unit is available for them in 3 years. That's great. So when there isn't enough housing underproduction, you get price increases. You get high demand, low supply, you get people competing for units, you get price increases. That also signals to the market, hey, build more. Hey, build more. The rents are going up, prices are going up, please, please, please increase supply. That's how housing markets are supposed to work. But there's that lag factor, and sometimes it's a market failure when a price increase does not result in an increase in quantity. If you can think about like clothing or cars or whatever other industry you think of, when the price goes up, producers want to produce more, and that actually helps equilibrate the market. The supply goes up, therefore prices come more in line with demand. But the housing market is just slow and sticky. Not the official term. So you all know this chart that's right here. This also results in the housing mismatch. And so I talked about this earlier. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. So, oh, I'm sorry, those are not the right numbers under the parentheses, sorry, under the percentages. I will fix that, I apologize. What this is showing is in the rows is the household income bucket. So ignore the dollar numbers for now, but if you were earning between 0 and 50% of the area median income, and you were occupying, so this is where the housing stock, this is what the housing stock costs, and this is what households earn. So if you earn 0 to 50% of the area median income, and you were living in a unit that also costs 0 to 50, you're in this gray box, you're matched. Good job. If you're earning 0 to 50, but you're occupying a unit that costs 50 to 80, you're considered cost burdened. You're spending more than 30% of your income on housing. Similarly, all the way up here, believe it or not, you'll have people in your community who are earning 0 to 50, who are living in a unit that would be affordable to someone earning 120% of the income, because there's not enough units. There's just not a lot of choice. You also have people who are earning 120 and living in a unit that would be affordable to people earning 120, or earning 100 to 120 and living in a unit that was appropriately matched. But you also have people who are renting, quote unquote, renting down. And so you would have, a person earning between 100 and 120% of area median income, occupying, I apologize. That's backwards. I'm pretty sure those are supposed to be the opposite way around. No, those are right. Oh, yes, no, okay. If you are earning 120, but you're living in a unit that's 0 to 50, you're down in this box, you're renting down. This is right. Sorry. No one would begrudge you for doing that. That's reasonable, it's like realistic. Maybe you're saving for your down payment. Maybe you like the unit and you don't need brand new features or the unit. Maybe you like the charm, maybe it's old. It's not a fault. It's not like a moral failing. It's just the fact that there's not enough units for people to self-sort. So the people renting down, it's not really a problem other than the fact that if there's not enough units of low-cost housing, those people are they're kind of taking a unit from someone else. So if a person's earning 120, but they're occupying a unit that would be affordable to a household earning 0 to 50, where is that person who's earning 0 to 50 going to live? They have fewer choices. They're probably going to be renting. They're probably going to be cost burdening themselves. And so the point is, the big point is that without enough units, like think about that filtering process, think about that housing life cycle chart, without enough units, you can't have people self-sorting, the market gets gummed up. This is also important for the home ownership market too. So if there aren't enough home ownership units that are kind of like entry-level, first-time homebuyer cost, you'll have renters who are ready to buy a home. Maybe they've saved enough money, maybe they've grown their income and they are ready to make the jump. They can't find a place, they can't afford a place, or there's just no stock available, there's just like no turnover. It's actually what's happening right now, where interest rates are 6 or 7%, mortgage rates, and people aren't selling because they might be locked into a 3% rate from 3 years ago. And if they sell, they have to buy a new house at 7%, and that is a big impact. It's like $600 or $700 per month of impact to your housing costs. So it's not just rents, it's also the entire housing market and like how people flow through it. And when there's not enough units, that flow breaks down.
did you also happen to look at, generational, like population sizes and generational trends? So like,
Yeah.
the millennials are a much, much bigger population by like 20 million over Gen X,
Mhm.
and then like they're the biggest in several generations, and how like millennials coming into the market have taken a huge amount of supply that really nationally, like builders they should have started planning for 20 years ago.
Well, and also.
But didn't, and so like, the only thing that's really slowed that down is that student loan costs are now slowing when people come in the market. But like, there's so many millennials moving into the market because they're in their 30s now that it's just eating up supply. And I personally, locally, think that's just as much of an issue as the out-of-staters coming in and taking up inventory, so.
Well, you also didn't mention the boomers, and the boomers,
Yes.
no offense, anyone in the room.
Boomers are staying in their homes
The
longer.
boomers are staying in their homes longer than prior generations as well. And there are many, many, many boomers. And the decades in which the boomer generation is kind of encapsulated, I mean, everyone dies, they will die, but it's not happening yet. And so that is another factor. It's not specifically related to cost burden, but it's related to like those macroeconomic factors about how supply is occupied and by whom, and how it allows people to flow through the market. When I was talking earlier about if you have, I was analyzing a community. It ended up not being true, but we were theorizing whether or not high-income people were leaving and low-income people were coming, and the stock of housing available in that community was primarily single-family. And if the people coming in can't afford that stock, and the people leaving want to sell it, there's going to be mass depreciation. There's going to be a big market correction, and that happens in some communities. It's not all at once. But there is talk about that happening with the boomer generation. When they do die or pass on their homes, it might not be the location that the next generation wants to live in. It might not be the product type that the next generation wants to live in. It might not be the price that the next generation can afford. And therefore, there might be, like, I'm not going to predict here, but like there could realistically be like macroeconomic corrections for that. So demographics is destiny is a saying, because our society has to adjust its needs, and we built schools for the boomers, and then we didn't need them for the Gen Xers, and then we needed them for the millennials, and so it's like we do adjust our built form to meet our population needs. Okay, so underproduction can be considered a market failure. When I was talking earlier about price and rent increases that are not being met with new supply, that is like one of the definitions of a market failure. It means that there are other factors at play that are limiting new supply from coming online, and people who want to build, people who can build are like slow. The quantity is not increasing at the rate it could be. This is also so all of these things things on the list can be correlated or even regression analyses like directly tied to lack of housing production, not enough supply, from vacancy and competition to rent increases as we've seen, cost burdening as we've seen, but also overcrowding, and that's that household formation thing where people are choosing they feel like they can't move out into their own unit because there's not a unit available in their price or amenity range. It's also correlated to traffic congestion. I mean, people are driving until they qualify for housing units. It's often cheaper to build housing in greenfield areas instead of an infill lot downtown for various reasons. And so it can be more, and this is also partly with that expansive versus expensive chart, but like the type of housing that can be built in far off places can be cheaper, not always, but can be cheaper than housing that's built in infill or in like downtown areas. And so you have people like driving for affordability. Before the pandemic, there were always news articles about people who drove 60 minutes to work, in a different county or in like 3 counties over or something like that. This happens in Colorado, the resort communities are really, really struggling, particularly year-round workers who can't afford to live because they don't have housing supply. And that's also a challenge where demand is nearly infinite. It's like, in those kinds of examples, it's where luxury buyers from other countries will just scoop up any product, and their willingness to pay is very high. And the local year-round occupants don't have a lot of opportunity, they don't have a lot of choice. I talked about housing instability and homelessness and homeownership being out of reach of a lot of people. So this, the Sightline Institute had this YouTube video that described housing underproduction or undersupply being like a game of musical chairs, but instead of taking a chair away, you add a person, and instead of it being a race to sit down, it's a bidding war. And so when there's more people and not enough seats, what happens? Price goes up and people lose out. Someone's not going to get to sit down. And I thought that was a really great analogy. Okay. So that was a lot about the challenges and theoretical about how housing markets should function, how they fail, and this section of the presentation will talk a little bit about the ways governments can support and intervene and affect market failures. So housing is very influenced by government. This is a graphic where, in theory, government could step in a lot of different places in the market. Theoretically, government could build, own, and operate its own housing. In the U.S., we don't typically do that. We tried, we failed. We don't invest in public housing very much anymore. A lot of it's being converted to private housing. Government can also just directly subsidize the development of more housing. If government wants more housing, there are all these ways they can do it. They could just directly subsidize construction. We do some of that. It's not always available. The money isn't always there. Not always desired by the community. Government can also encourage or incentivize the construction of housing. And that is a tool that a lot of places use. And then also, on the very end, government can simply just allow more housing. And that's the least kind of market intervention and the kind of often, not always, the easiest tool to use. But it's also important to note, like in that second bullet, that you have to do number 4 before you can do any of the other ones. If it's not allowed, it's literally illegal to build housing. Even the government won't build it, or they can't subsidize it, they can't encourage it if it's illegal. So number 4 is a tool that can be used and is used around the country, and it ends up being a lower impact of market intervention and letting the market kind of do its thing. The way government can intervene, I've put this in a couple different ways. This is the development construction timeline. So you go all the way from site selection and land, then you design your project, you get it permitted, then you finance it, then you build it, and then you operate it. And these are all the different ways that governments can intervene at each step of the way. So when it comes to site selection, there's zoning, there's place making, there's growth management, which is like telling cities and telling developers where you can put what. Or long-term regional planning about what you want to have in what place over time. In the project design and permitting, you can just talk about design and height, and you can look at your permitting timeline and shorten that, because as I mentioned before, development is on debt. It's funded by debt, so the longer it takes, the more the more interest you're paying, and the more that you need to charge in your rent or your price to cover the cost. On the financing side, there's grants, there's low-cost loans. You can offer tax waivers or tax abatements. You can reduce or allow developers to finance the fees rather than pay them up front. That can kind of save money. On the construction side, there's parking requirements or parking costs. There's the cost of infrastructure. Governments can influence the type of materials that are required, not necessarily the cost. They can also influence contracting requirements. I don't suspect that a lot of these tools are a problem. I know they're not a problem here. This is a development-friendly community. So a lot of these tools can't actually be used because they're not barriers in the first place. But these are typically the interventions governments can make. But it's also important to think about those same categories, the different impacts that they can have. You have regional planning and site selection and land control all the way at the top, where it affects the biggest number of units across a region, so that has the broadest impact. All sites in a city, or even a region, or even a state, like in Oregon. All the way down to like the narrowest impact of like specific financing. You could have an overlay zone, or you could say this commercial corridor is designated for growth, and therefore we're going to offer low-cost loans because we're not getting the unit that we want, the unit mix we want. We're not getting what we want, so we're going to incentivize it. That could be on an area, or in a zone, or a specific site. And then all the way down operations, it just gets narrower. But it's really important that policies are created with the development and building community. They cannot be done behind closed doors. It needs to be a process that allows for careful calibration that's grounded in real market data. And you also need to make sure that the policies will actually overcome the specific barrier that is in front of the developer, the actual bottleneck. They also need to be revisited frequently and recalibrated as markets change and as conditions change. Okay, any questions on that section? Or what I just
If I could, so just curious, are people looking at trying to protect markets as well? Like, for instance, you have overseas investors trying to buy housing, or are governments concerned about that as an issue for policy?
That's a good question. That's a really tricky thing to do.
Free market.
Yeah, it's generally like less intervention rather than more intervention. I have heard that the closest thing I can think of to that is that some communities have set up regulations that allow for a kind of dual market, and I've heard of this in Aspen, and I think it's more like these extreme situations where there's really limited supply in resort communities, and you need teachers and firefighters and staff for the ski resorts. Like, you need the people to live there. And what I've heard of, what I've researched, is that the government will have basically two markets. There will be workforce housing that you have to literally be an employee of the city or an employee of the region to live in this unit, and it's regulated to be affordable for you. And then the rest of the market can go bonkers. And sure, you can have a Russian or Chinese or you name it, Qatari person who wants to build or buy a cabin on the mountain in Aspen, and they're going to be able to, and they're going to be able to pay whatever they want. And those are extreme. I'm not trying to be rude or I'm just being hyperbolic with those examples. But you can have extreme willingness to pay for a luxury product or a scarce product, a product that will likely increase in value. Housing in this country is an investment vehicle. That's just how it's set up. And that is not limited to just U.S. citizens. Okay, so when we look at the Regional Housing Coordination Plan, there's these QR codes in the back. It's also available on Compass's website. You guys can pull it up if you'd like, read it if you'd like. The reason that Compass wanted to look into the Regional Housing Coordination Plan is for all these reasons behind me and all the reasons we've been talking about today. You can kind of see the evolution of these headlines over time. When will growth slow? We're losing population. Will the market crash? You're still growing. It's complicated. But the coordination plan was basically an attempt at Compass to say, given the volatility in the housing market, given what's been happening, given the negative social outcomes that we've seen with cost burdening and housing instability and other challenges, do we have a role? What can we do? How can we enter this conversation? We can provide market data, we can provide reports, we can gather folks around the table. What is our role? How should we go about determining that role? And what, if any, work on housing should Compass be doing? And so that's kind of the big question that the Regional Housing Coordination Plan sought to answer. We went through a pretty robust process of community engagement with an affordable housing advisory work group that is still meeting to this day. I think they're meeting next week. We did a robust market analysis of demographics and housing market changes, and it was about the 2 different counties and 14 cities and the unincorporated areas of the counties to kind of look at what were the underproduction trends and also what's a future forecasted needs. So that's the housing needs analysis. We said, based on current population projections from Compass, what would need to be built in the future to not only meet future population growth, but also dig out from the underproduction that was happening, that has happened and is present to today. So the coordination plan has research on best practices and those government interventions that I went through today. It also, importantly, really identifies some successful policies that are working well now, and examples from the region that other cities can look to, and other planners like at City of Nampa can go talk to Caldwell and say, what are you doing, how did you implement that? And then it also identifies near-term policy, priority actions for Compass to keep exploring. So there was quite a lot of public involvement. Like I said, there was this work group. We did a survey for that work group. We also did a set of interviews for other stakeholders who weren't represented on the work group. We gave a presentation to the Technical Advisory Committee and the Compass Board, and then we had the final report. We had a subcontractor from a local subcontractor here called Idaho. They do housing and planning and other, I think, transportation planning work in the region, and they were involved on a lot of the public involvement. They conducted this survey, put together that word cloud of like, what were the issues that were being highlighted? If Compass has a role in housing and if they want to help their member agencies kind of right-size markets and increase supply and ameliorate some challenges, what are the challenges and what are the barriers? And so that survey was pretty important. It wasn't a large sample size, it was like 30 people, but it's a really good start, and I think that there's a lot more surveying work being done by BSU and other students and other researchers in the region. The summary of key findings, there was basically 4. Supply and demand are imbalanced, the region is growing really, really fast, and in kind of uncoordinated ways. There was a lot of talk about development being approved here without concern or without thinking very carefully about the development right here or the one that just happened 2 years ago right here. And so uncoordinated, it's like you've been building a lot, you're still not building enough, and so how do you be careful to help coordinate it without slowing it down? And that's a really tricky place to be in. Another key finding was affordability was at risk just because of the supply and demand imbalance, that every community has housing needs at every income level. Every single community in this region has people earning 0 to 30 and 30 to 50 and 50 to 80 and 120 plus. Like, if you don't believe your community has it, they do. You do. You have poor people. They're everywhere. I didn't mean it to sound that way. But just like every community has housing need at every income level. And every partner is needed. People are needed to be brought to the table, and it's going to take a regional effort to help overcome some of the challenges. So finding that the work group thought was appropriate was that regional coordination is a missing piece. The report highlights what is working well. So these are some examples of policies that the work group highlighted and the survey highlighted. Not a comprehensive list by any means, but it's just some examples of where things are in place and what people wanted to see more of to help solve some of the supply challenges. And the other key takeaway was really that the housing coordination plan is seen as the first step. If Compass is trying to figure out what is its role in housing provision, what is its role in housing coordination, does it have a role? This advisory work group is helping to shape those answers. And this plan really just sets the foundation of how not only Compass, but all the partners and all the member agencies can work together to help ameliorate the housing challenges that are happening. These early strategies and early actions are for Compass to continue hosting conversations, putting its arms around the big conversations that need to happen, and then also like developing further questions that need to be studied or further plans that need to be implemented. And so these are those 5 near-term strategies that we identified. The plan also has 70, 20 longer-term strategies that would be a phase 2 effort, or they're not really Compass's jurisdiction. Compass can't change zoning. Compass can't, do a funding incentive program necessarily. So understanding what it can and can't do, and then also setting the stage for those jurisdictions that want to, that should implement other policies. That's kind of the phase 2 work. Continue meeting the work group. Check. Good. It's done. It's not done. They're meeting next week. The group does continue to meet. I think there's about 20 or so people on it. And a finding that was pretty important was also to think about ways to encourage housing growth in areas where infrastructure already existed, so impact areas, areas that already have water and sewer and electrical. There was a lot of concern for the loss of natural areas and the loss of recreational areas, and traffic. So trying to corral that growth in areas that are already served by infrastructure is a way to ameliorate some of those other impacts. That also was aligned with number 3 because of the way Compass's population forecast methodology was conducted. It was allocating a lot of population to unincorporated areas. And then developers would go and see that and say, hey, go rezone this for me so I can build this to meet your needs. And that is, there's an entire demographic advisory work group, I think is what it's called, at Compass that does the population forecast, but and it gets really complicated and really technical, but there is a chance to reconsider from a values direction if that direction is given. There could be changes to that methodology to adjust where population is allocated. Again, that's a big decision that the board of directors would have to undertake. Continue offering housing, education, and training opportunities. There was an identified lack of education, lack of awareness, lack of understanding, particularly with people who are decision makers or elected officials, don't understand. Maybe they'll watch the YouTube video, I don't know. Don't understand some of the fundamentals and the obstacles that people are up against, and also how housing markets respond to those challenges. And then specifically, the work group called for advocacy for state policy changes to increase the amount of affordable housing gap funding, just recognizing that there isn't a lot in Idaho, and there was some that came out of pandemic-related federal fund allocations, but I think it's already been spent, and it generated a lot of units, and it's creating a lot of positive change, and that part of the development community is really hungry for more. Whew, that is it.